The theater has always been the hallowed hall of the live, happening in front of you experience for audiences. And these audiences come to listen, to learn, enjoy, and even to judge those who show their wares. It's not taped, not filmed, but dangerously live. No interruptions, no retakes, a first-time only experience. There is no substitute. But let's be realistic. The theater is a business enterprise. Despite its mantle of art, there is money to be raised, advertising to be bought, tickets to be sold, salaries to be paid, contracts to be drawn, and lawyers to be retained. Even in the nonprofit theater, business concerns must be addressed. In this segment of Producing for the Theater, we'll deal with the pragmatic, the unglamorous side, the business aspect of theater. This is the domain of the suits, as they're called, the managers, the accountants, and the business producers. We're going to talk about the mercantile world of building a budget and being responsible merchants of the arts. The business side is, after all, just another phase of the mystery that makes theater the magical experience it truly is. And we have a special guest with us today who will take us down the street of dreams to the bank that makes the theater thrive. I'm Mike Merrick, inviting you to join us in our continuing adventure of producing for the theater. Well, we're back, and we're fortunate enough to have with us a good friend of mine, Mr. Glen Cassale, who's a noted director in the theater and television, who's done these video classes before. And thank you very much for being here again, Glen. It's interesting, he is here because he is a director, but I don't think that many of you would be that readily familiar with a creative director who directs theater, who directs television, being cognizant of and being involved with the business aspect of the theater. And I think he can explain that. And as you know, Glen, we have a number of students with us, some that you've taught, some that have been in certain classes that I've taught, etc. So if you'd be good enough, why don't you give us a director's view of the business side of the theater and why it's vitally important to you.
Okay, first of all, thanks for having me back, Mike. I've been in directing theater for about 20 years now, and over the last 20 years, I've seen a change in the business of theater and the way business operates with the producers and all of those elements. The business of directing today, you have to know where the project is going to be, what the size of the project is, before you start working on the creative element. Is it going to be an off-Broadway show? Is it going to be a Broadway show? Is it going to be a tour? If it's going to be a tour, how many trucks do you want it to fit into? How long is the turnaround when you get to each city? Is it 8 hours? Is it 2 days? That all depends on what you're going to do creatively. And you are deciding on how you're going to create the project by what funds are available.
Well, it's an interesting aspect of it. Some people may take it for granted, but nevertheless, we're going to get into it. We're lucky enough to have with us today Michael Gill, who is a leading general manager who runs here. He will tell you what a general manager really does. They practically run shows, who's been involved with a number, which he will talk about, etc. And it's interesting that you should say that from a director's point of view about you being involved with budgets and a phrase like turnaround, which I think we have to explain to our general student audience, both at universities throughout the country and here. But Michael Gill, I think, will do that extremely well. But what it stresses, and you can take up on this, is the fact that it is a collaborative effort in the theater.
Yes, today all those discussions have to be made up front. When somebody offers a project today, you want to say to them, where is the project going to be done? How big is the budget? And trying to get them to solidify for you at least a ballpark or an idea of what the size of the show is you're going to be working with.
Yes, because if you have maybe we've all read novels, seen plays, motion pictures about the temperamental director with his coat thrown over his shoulders, says, no, no, I must have this and I must have that. Well, it's very funny when you see it in the movie, but if it happens in reality, it can be terribly destructive.
Yes, because also today, everything is built on how long a show is going to run. As a director, if you decide, okay, I can save this to pay for that, to help the budget, that's something that you can do, and I think that collaboration has to be worked out with the director and the producing element, so that the play can have a life.
And the overall hands-on individual is the general manager. That's why later on when Michael Gill comes on, he will get into the specifics of it. I almost didn't say that correctly, But nevertheless, and our students who are here with us today can also address certain questions to him that can be very germane to what we want to know about the theater. The theater is a dynamic thing, you know that. I mean, it changes every day. I mean, what was worked a year ago doesn't work now.
Right.
So we have to get into that. We have to deal, as you just said, with the business aspect.
And also today, theater has become much more of a corporate structure, which has many people involved dealing with the budget above the line and in the producing element, the general manager being one of them, but the producers and the list of producers today that go above the title.
Well, we'll talk about that, the list of producers that go above the title, which is something that I spoke about briefly in one of our shows. What does a producer do, which is sometimes it's comedic and sometimes it's tragic, but nevertheless, what do they do? Because is the name above the title, just because you have 15 names, people would say, well, does everybody make a decision? I think we're going to leave a lot of that to Michael as well. Everybody's going to wait for him, anticipating the arrival of...
but it's interesting, over the years that I've been directing, the general manager's position has become stronger and stronger. And it becomes a person that I have more of a daily contact with. I have a tour out now of Peter Pan with Kathy Rigby, and daily I'm on the phone with the general manager, not the producer as much, but with the general manager, because it's day-to-day activities.
It's rather unusual for a director now to do what you just said, to communicate with the general manager on a regular basis. And then, of course, we have to find out, I'm quite sure that a couple of the students are wondering, what is the difference between a general manager and a company manager?
Right.
And Michael will get into that as well. But there are so many aspects to it. I think our viewers, our students, wherever they may be, have to understand that yes, it's art, yes, it's glamorous, yes, it's exciting, yes, it's opening night, wow. But boy, you got to get down to the bottom line. You have to know what is your budget, and that's what we have to get into.
And it's all about the bottom line. And I also think it's interesting that these two, company manager and general manager, are two new fields in the business that are great fields for students to become involved in the theater. That is backstage. It's not always just on stage.
Well, yeah, it's backstage, it's in the box office, it's all the way. It's helping build a show, helping create a show. There's more to it than the scenic design. Because if you don't have the people that are there working on the numbers, which a lot of us may get bored with, I certainly do, and I think I understand. I mean, I'm learning every day also. Let's be perfectly candid of it. The day you stop learning, you stop doing well.
Absolutely.
So,
I also think the other thing that has become more important today in the theater, or one of the most important things, is advertising. Getting the word out about your show. How is it going to be advertised? What is the graphic going to be? That's something that I've been involved with all along, because we are selling the idea of the show. What is the image of the show? When I was doing Camelot a couple of years ago, I was going to do a tour of Camelot, and that graphic on the Camelot poster was really important. What was it going to show? Is it the triangle of this love thing? Is it just advertising a star?
yes.
You know?
It's important that a director should get involved with it, because a director has a vision. And that vision should be, to a great extent, I don't know, synchronized, if you will, and then delivered. Because if a director has this vision and you're advertising it from here, you're not really doing what the show's about. So consequently, the director and the creative people should be involved in the marketing and the advertising, which I think is a wonderful development. But it's still the business side of the theater.
Because today I think it's important that most people really make a decision how they're going to spend their dollars. And to get people in the theater to spend a $100 ticket, a $90 ticket, you've got to make sure they're going in and getting product that's right for them, and they're looking at it cautiously, because to take a family, it's $400.
Absolutely. And from our point of view, by our point of view, I'm talking about the creative and business people, we have to make sure that the bucks we put into it, that we are running in a certain way whereby the show will recoup in a certain period of time. What are the running costs? Again, I go back to Michael Gill, we'll talk about it. What is your break even, etc.? Those are the things we're going to get into in the next couple of minutes. And we all have to be aware of it. You can't shield yourself from it. You can't say, as I said before, I'm an artist, I don't want to know. Those days are gone.
Right.
It's self-destructive to do that. Artists have to be business people.
It also comes down to this as the director. Money defines the rehearsal schedule. 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 8 weeks, it's all money. Gypsy, the last Gypsy that was on Broadway at Bernadette Peters, rehearsed 9.5 weeks. That's not typical today.
No, it's a long
9.5
time.
weeks.
Well, was it Sam Mendes?
Yes.
He wanted it. Sam Mendes is a very big British director, but he has the muscle to demand it. Whether he needed it or not is questionable.
And it's costly.
But you have to see. You can't say, you know this very well. A producer can't say, I don't want to spend that. You spend it if you need it. But sometimes you have to be able to eliminate what is self-gratification. So we'll get into that as well on our little next segment. And now to get into the basic, definitive aspect of the business of the theater, the business side of the theater, we're fortunate to have with us a general manager of note, my good friend, Mr. Michael Gill, who I might say is presently headquartered in Las Vegas and is the general manager for such shows as Mamma Mia, We Will Rock You, and the upcoming Las Vegas presentation of the legendary Phantom of the Opera. And Michael, I might add, was the manager of Phantom of the Opera when it ran in New York. He was there for 10 years with it. The show is still running there. But nevertheless, we're very pleased to have you here, Michael. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think the best way to start is to have you give us your definition, if you will, of what a general manager does. What is a general manager within the framework of the theater?
What's interesting, it's a question I get asked quite often, actually. What's a producer? What's a general manager? What's the lines of demarcation? Who does what? And I have to say that I've done 22 shows on Broadway, and each show was a different sort of scenario for me, depending on how hands-on a producer is. And I know in one of your previous segments you discussed an active participating producer versus somebody who just puts up money, so each play or each musical that comes along, the relationship can be quite different. But basically, the broad definition would be, if a producer has an idea, has a script, or just an idea for a show, and can have the wherewithal to raise the money for that show, he can hire somebody like myself, a general manager, to do a budget for that show. In order to do a budget, it takes quite a bit of knowledge about all the various unions. There are currently 13 unions working on Broadway today, and you have to know the rules for each and every one of them. On top of the ones that are actively in the theater building itself, you have people like the Teamsters, who, if you're trying to get your scenery from your truck into the theater, the sidewalk is Teamster territory.
Of course.
So there's lots of, and New York City has its own quirks about how do you unload 45-foot trailers, and there's lots of experience that you have to have in knowing how to budget. So a producer would hire a general manager to do a budget, and then it's the general manager's job to make sure that that show comes in for that amount of money. So budgeting, I would say, is the most crucial part of a general manager's job. Once a budget has been agreed to, the producer says, yes, I'm comfortable with raising this much money. It meets in with the director's artistic vision of what the show should be. The general manager would then go and negotiate all the various contracts with the director, choreographer, designers. In some instances, if there's no collective bargaining agreement with the various unions, Actors Equity, IATSE, AFM, the Musicians Union, sometimes you'll get into union negotiations. And then once the contracts have been negotiated and written, normally in conjunction with the show attorney, but usually the general manager basically drafts the agreement. He negotiates the terms, drafts the agreement, the attorney would sign off on the legal language. Those contracts are then turned over to a company manager who works under the general manager, and the company manager actually executes those contracts. So if the director's contract says on the first day of rehearsal, pay the director X amount of dollars, the company manager ensures that that payment gets made. If the director's from out of town and his contract says every day he's out of town, he gets a hotel room, he gets so much a day per diem, the company manager would be the person who actually, he takes what the general manager negotiates and he executes it on behalf of the production. Now, all of us, the general manager, the company manager, the entire support team on the management side is always answerable to the producer, because the buck always stops with the producer.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this, and I think Glenn would want to get into this as well. You mentioned very briefly at the start of your comments that it depends on the kind of producer. What is the kind of producer who, as opposed to being hands-on, which is admirable, is interfering, which is not admirable? How do you deal with that? I mean, I've come across it, but I'd like it from the point of view of a general manager such as yourself.
Well, you talked in your earlier comments about seeing these shows. You've all seen playbills where there's a million names above the title, and a lot of what those people are 30 years ago, I would have called them investors. They're not really producers as much as they're people that believe in the project, who can write a check or have a friend write a check and invest in the production. And nowadays, you sort of, in exchange for writing a very large check, you sort of get your name above the title as well.
Sure.
Well, along with that, Mike, as you know, if you get your name above the title, they all would like some say in how the show should look, what stars may or may not be in the production. Lots of different ideas pop up from these extra producers. And I think in terms of a controlling producer, and I've certainly had my share of what I would call novice producers, a lot of what I do is to help train producers. If they come in and I've had many people say, no, we're not using any unions, we're going all non-union on Broadway, and I just smile and say, well, that's unrealistic, that's not going to happen. You'll never get the show up and on, and if you did, you would have nothing but picket line after picket line after picket line. So let's re-examine this. Maybe there's a different way to mount your vision, that maybe you don't have to go to Broadway if you're dead set against non-union. Recently, and we discussed this recently, I was involved in what I would call a mega spectacular that was doing a major production out of town. It happened to be in Los Angeles. The producer came to me and said, we have this epic show that we would like to present. And I quickly calculated what off the top of my head, I knew that was a $10 million plus production. I've done enough large scale shows to know what that kind of epic with 50 to 80 actors might cost. And when he told me that the budget was indeed going to be $2.5 million, and he wasn't willing to budge, I respectfully backed out of the production because I said, I don't know how to achieve that. I'm not sure that anybody knew how to achieve that,
Yeah,
but I knew.
It's unrealistic.
It's unrealistic, and there comes a point in time when, as you said, it's a collaboration amongst, director, general manager, producer. Everybody has to be on the same page. If this team isn't on the same page, when you start adding the different levels, the directors, the cast, if it's a star, they're all going to have their own input into what that ultimate show should be. And it'll be nothing but headaches for everybody. So I'm very, very big believer in the collaborative dialogue,
Absolutely.
especially amongst these people on this.
Well, there are
panel.
enough headaches that are unexpected, and that between the best of people,
Right.
headaches occur. So you don't want to create headaches in front. You mentioned something to Glenn and to me the other day when we chatted with you about making something cheap, good, and fast.
Right. It's I learned early on when I was a manager apprentice. My first Broadway show was Barnum in '79, and there's my union's called ATPAM. It's a managers union and press agents union, and you go through a number of years of apprenticeship. You learn the old-fashioned way through apprenticing to a show on Broadway, and I was fortunate enough to apprentice to a great manager who's no longer with us, named Charlie Willard, and Charlie showed me the model of, it's a triangle, good, fast, and cheap. You can have any two sides of the triangle, you can never have three. You can have it good and fast, but it's not going to be cheap. And you can see how the triangle works, but that model, that good, fast, cheap model, works every day of my business.
Sure.
And in fact, I said to the producer who came to me with a $2.5 million budget, I said, you're trying to violate the good, fast, cheap triangle. You want it good, you want it fast, and you want it cheap, and that's never going to happen. I've never seen one show that has violated that.
Go ahead, Glenn.
And I find that some of the most successful things I've done as a director, and that allows me to do my most creative work, is when the producing element and the general manager work in that collaboration and understand the work process, what I need, how much rehearsal time I need. They keep me aware of where I'm going to go into overtime, where I'm overspending, how many trucks it has to fit into.
Absolutely.
And I think, because that kind of communication to me, as much as I want to be creative, I have a restriction on me then in my creativity that I've got to abide by. And in the end, that's right, all three of us are working for the same final product.
Absolutely, and I think especially, Glenn, in a new production that's never been mounted, you have a great advantage if you're mounting a revival, even if it's a drastically different revival. You sort of know the territory you're going into. If you're starting with a script, even by the best writers, I know, and Mike knows, that somewhere in the process, changes are going to be made. It's going to evolve. It's going to grow into what that show wants to be. So when I budget for a brand new show that's never been done before, I have all kinds of contingency money hidden in my budget that I know that I'm protected, because the process of a new show giving birth, you have to allow it to grow in a certain way, in a certain artistic way, or else you might as well not even start off on the venture. And I always accommodate that by making sure that there's enough in contingency, extra money, put aside specifically for all the what-if scenarios.
And you know, it used to be that a show could go out of town and work out its problems, a new show. Today, most new shows, where you start, you're out in front of people. I don't care where you go, you're out there, it's out there. So you're going to get feedback right away.
That's
you
right.
can go as far as you want to hide, but somebody's going to know about that show today because of the internet and all the high-speed communication we have.
It's absolutely true. I've always said that no matter if you're in Boston or Australia, you know, because of the internet and because we're all, you know, connected now through technology, it is, you're a flop or you're a hit with your very first preview.
Overnight.
Overnight, boy, the buzz is on the street, and you know, it's what they call the theater paparazzi network. They're out there, they know. Oh, that's a flop. Oh no, I heard that was really good. And you know, the buzz is just out in the world.
And you know, you come to a position in a new show that you say, okay, we've got X amount of dollars. We see in front of us that it needs this change, whether it be all the costumes need to be changed or the set isn't working. And again, you've got to sit down and have that collaboration with the three of us of how do we make this change.
That's right.
In a realistic way.
That's right.
And adhere to the budget at the same time.
That's right.
And having said that, I would like Michael to get into some specifics that you, Glenn, and I touched upon. We use the phrases turnaround. We use the phrases break even. And some people may know it, some of the students watching us may understand it, and many of them won't. Vitally important phrases which I would like you, Michael, to deal with. the break even of a show, the percentage. You and I have had this conversation
Right.
before. You taught me
right.
about the difference between what happens in Las Vegas and what happens in the general theater throughout the country. And what is the break even? What should a producer or the managing entity, the suits, which we're all looking very well in, deal with? What is the break even? Is it 60%, 70%? Would you address that for us?
Absolutely. When I do a budget, I do two different budgets. I do a budget called the pre-production budget. It's everything we need to get to opening night. It's fees, creative fees to director designers. It's building the scenery, building the costumes, all the rehearsal salaries for the actors, the load-in for the crew. That's in the pre-production budget. That's a very fixed number. The break-even refers to the weekly operating budget, which is a totally separate budget. Once you start performances, the weekly operating budget kicks in.
Also known as running costs.
Running costs. Well, it's what you need to get through 1 week of the show. And it's usually some fixed costs, and then there's usually some sort of percentage royalty, which would go back to the creative people. And that's known as break even, or sometimes it's called making your nut. Then that would be where the amount of money needed to break even on a given week.
Would you get into the royalty structure with all of us for a moment? What are the royalties and what should the ceiling be on royalties for straight play, and what should the ceiling be for royalties on a musical?
Well, unfortunately, and I've been doing this since the mid-'70s.
That's why I'm asking.
The ceiling, Mike, as you know, keeps creeping up and up and up.
Yeah, the last time I looked, it was 15, and now what happened? I know.
Exactly. I can tell you some of the minimums that are out there in the world. Dramatist Guild minimum. Dramatist Guild represents writers of Broadway musicals. Their traditional royalty structure is it's called 2-2-2. 2% to a book writer of a musical, 2% to the lyricist, and 2% to the composer. Now, if you're dealing with somebody high profile, a Stephen Sondheim, that caliber of person, of course they're going to get above what the minimum is. But that's sort of a starting point. SSD&C, the Director and Choreographers Union, have their own minimums. 2% director, 1.5% choreographer. USA, United Scenic Artists, also have their own minimums for costume designer, set designer, lighting designer. So normally, Mike, what I would say on a play, you're looking at about 8 to 10% for royalty package. On musicals, it can go anywhere from 15 to 22%, depending on the caliber of people you're working with.
Now, what about the practice? I think a very healthy one. I hope you'll agree, of having royalty participants take less of a royalty until recoupment.
It's mandatory. I believe
But
that...
isn't it vital?
Absolutely. It is vital, Mike. I think what's happened, again, with the escalating costs of musicals, I mean, we all hear dollar numbers thrown out of, what Lion King cost, or what, a show I did, Phantom cost, or, it keeps going up and up and up and up. And with these escalating production costs to get the show up and on, the producers are looking to the creative staff to say, okay, you know what, give us a break until our investors make back their money. Take a little bit less until we break even, the investors have recouped, and then if we're all making money, and isn't that great? Because you want those investors to come back a second and third time.
Exactly.
To invest in the next show or the next show.
And you want to show that you're looking out for them.
Absolutely, Mike. And I think that the idea of it's called a royalty pool, and there's many different kinds of pools. Basically, the most common pool is where creative people such as Glenn or the designers or the choreographer take a percentage of net profits as opposed to straight box office gross. The old-fashioned way was, you have your box office at the end of the week, you've earned this much money over the week, that's your box office gross for the week. If the director gets 2%, the director got 2% of it. It was sent off to him. Box office statements would back up whatever we paid to a director. Nowadays what happens is you start with your box office gross, you back off all of your costs, all of your fixed costs, actor salaries, stage crew salaries, advertising, a very big number in that mix, theater rent, anything that can be documented. And at the end of the day, you end up with some sort of net profit pre-royalty. That net profit is then split. A very traditional pool is 35-65, meaning that 35% of the net profit would go to the combined creative staff. 65% would go back to the investor to recoup their investment. And if you had a flow chart, you would see that way of doing things, when a show is doing marginal business, they're right at their break-even point, you would see that it genuinely helps the show out. Because at break-even, the creative staff is getting less and less. If you're at 100% capacity, then they're actually getting more than they would have gotten off of straight royalties. So if it's
And you have to fight greed.
Absolutely.
That's the danger, greed.
Absolutely.
You know, I taught a class this past semester, as Glenn knows, about producing the play, and a couple of the students that were with me are here tonight, and they heard me talk about royalty pools and talk about cutting royalties a certain degree until payback, etc. I would like to find out if any of the students at the moment have any questions for Michael Gill pertaining to what he just talked about, which I think was in great detail. And it's vitally important, and it's very, very difficult to grasp firsthand if you don't ask some questions. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but do any of you, before I said yes, Bernadette, go ahead. Ask Mr. Gill a question.
Hi.
I'd like to know, how do you go about planning the budget and when?
You plan it as early as possible, and how I go about when I do a budget, I ask as many questions as possible. My budgets are only as good as the information that's been given to me. A lot of times I'll be given a script, just words on a page, and then I'm left to my own device to try to figure out, what the writer's intent is. If I'm lucky enough to have a director on board when I'm doing a budget, I'm going to really sit and just quiz him as much as I can. Well, okay, it says that there's a lavish scene, dance number unfolding. What does that mean? Is it going to rain on stage? Do you have 100 bodies up there? Is there a major costume change? Describe your initial vision in as much detail as you currently have to me. Because again, the more information I have, the more specific I can get. I like to budget in terms of other shows. When I talk to producers or directors, I'll say, okay, we haven't designed the scenery. Is the scenery going to be more like Lion King, epic, a lot of elevators, a lot of moving pieces, or is it something very simple? Is it Night Mother? Is it one unit set? What are we talking about here? A lot of times I'll have my gut feeling from reading the script, but sometimes I'm way off base, I have to tell you. Mm-hmm. I have been way off base on scenes that seem very simple, and they end up being very, very complex.
That's why the terminology collaborative effort, right,
Absolutely,
Glenn?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Glenn?
And the technology has changed so much that every year you've got to rethink what you're going to budget the next year.
That's correct.
Sets, lights, costumes,
Right.
we all know how that's changed so much. Even sound over the last few years. Just look at that, the difference in sound.
Sound, special effects is creeping into more and more Broadway shows. It means keeping up with all the different union rules. They change every year. The rates change, the benefits change. A big dollar item in all of my pre-production budgets is loading in of the physical production, the scenery into the theater. I can tell you when we loaded in Phantom of the Opera into the Majestic Theater, there was quite a good renovation that had to be done. The basement wasn't deep enough to house the candelabra that we didn't want them to come up in stages. We wanted candelabra, 14 feet to candelabra, to come up in one piece up through the floor. Well, that involved a lot of jackhammering, a lot of city permits. It was quite complex, to be perfectly honest. So it's tying into new rates. You always have to be up on the newest union rates, newest union rule books. Technology, scenic technology has just grown tremendously over the last 10 years. It's sort of staggering.
Well, everybody wants to see spectacle now.
That's right.
They're not
That's
interested in
right.
spectacles and stars, etc., which is a different subject. Aren't the problems basically different and probably more complex with a touring show when it comes to take-in, when it comes to traveling? Glenn mentioned in passing, it's a show with 2 trucks, etc. Why don't you get into that a little bit with us,
Right.
Michael? About
When you plan a national tour, you want to know what kind of national tour is it. There's a couple of kinds in my mind. There's a kind where the mega productions, Phantom when it first went out, Lion King, Cats, Les Mis, Miss Saigon, that brand of spectacle. When you tour, you want to know how many weeks is it intended to sit down in each city? Is it meant to sit down for 1 week at a time? That's a very different kind of tour than if it's meant to sit down for 3 or 4 months at a time. And you would budget accordingly. Sometimes you want to build what I call a leapfrog set, so that as the shows, let's say, in one city, a duplicate set is being loaded into the next city.
or a complex part of
Or
it.
complex part of it, right. And that's very common now, to leapfrog certain aspects of a show, maybe the show deck, maybe some of the electrics, maybe a duplicate sound package. But it's a real consideration in leapfrogging if you have to make quick jumps, but there's no way to load in your show in 8 hours.
And the problem you face sometimes, having said that, is that the next stop may have a show in there, so you can't get into the house.
That's correct.
And also
That's right.
with a tour, you've got to be aware of the different states' guidelines and rules.
Absolutely.
Child labor laws,
Absolutely.
workman's comp, all of that stuff comes into it.
Business side of the theater.
Absolutely. It has
kill you.
it has gotten more and more complex going to different states. More and more states have caught on to, oh, here's an outside entity coming into our state making a lot of money. Let's go after them for taxes.
Taxes,
So
absolutely.
knowing that state's taxes has become a major burden for what my firm does.
We're into it with Peter Pan. I have Peter Pan on tour right now. And there are certain cities where the little boy playing Michael cannot perform after 7:30 at night. And that means the whole run, we've got to put the understudy on because that boy can't rehearse, can't play except matinees.
That's right.
And what about theaters where you have structural problems, size problems? For instance, you have a show that needs a certain amount of wing space, a certain amount of fly space, and you got it all worked out beautifully, and then you suddenly realize, oh my God, the next stop, we can't fly this, we can't do that. You have to do some kind of radical adjustment.
Well, hopefully, if most shows are booked through a traditional theater booking agent, and if they've done their job,
Well.
they will have, that's what I say, if they've done their job, they will have already spoken to the technical director for the
Stage
show.
plan.
Stage plan, and know that this show needs 32 feet of stage depth, it needs this much wing space, it needs this many line sets free and clear, and if they're good, they will only book you in spaces that are appropriate for you. Now, every tour I've done, and I've done about 7 national tours, I always end up in a scenario exactly what you're saying, and then it's up to myself, the head carpenter, and the production stage manager to go, what are we going to cut?
Right.
What pieces of scenery are we going to cut? How can we get the show up and on? It is about, theater is a tradition of the show goes on,
Sure.
and somehow the show goes on.
And usually they send the plan out. I mean, competent people do. They send it out weeks in advance to the theater, and usually they say, can you handle it? And here are the 2 words that make me shiver. Don't worry.
Right.
The minute somebody says don't worry, I worry. Now, can we get a couple of other questions? Aaron, are you ready to ask anything of, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Actually, I had a question regarding royalties. Does it vary from musical to straight play? And does it vary whether it's a revival or if it's a brand new production of a play?
It usually doesn't change if it's a revival or brand new production. The royalty structure is pretty much the same. It does vary drastically between play and musical.
Okay.
It's a very different royalty structure.
And you had talked about the 2, 2, and 2 with the lyricist and the composer in the book.
Right.
What if it's someone like Stephen Sondheim who's written all three, or written at least two of those? Is that
I would say that somebody like Stephen Sondheim would be more in the 8% category than the 6% category.
Okay.
Right.
Fortunately for us, Michael Gill allowed us to twist his arm and to stay on a few more minutes because we want to do some more detailed, comprehensive questioning from the students that we have with us today. Because rather than just Glenn and I, who understand most of this, get into it, it's good that the students who this is addressed to get into the questions. So I'd like to do that. Ben, do you have a question for Mr. Gill?
Actually, I was wondering about what you were talking about earlier, the names above, all the names that go above the title. I've been noticing a lot more recently, big corporate names going above the title, Coca-Cola, Nike, things like that. How does a big corporation in a producer role affect, like, say, the independent producer, a small littler operation? And if both of them are involved, who takes the lead on this?
Well, normally, kind of promotional producer relationship, which is what you're referring to, there's usually some sort of cross promotion that may or may not involve the cast changing hands. I think a famous one is the current Moving Out campaign with Visa, which I just think is brilliant, by the way, where Moving Out got a nationwide television commercial and sponsorship in with the Visa credit card. Those kinds of relationships are really promotional aspects of the show. Clearly, Nike or Coke, I don't believe would want an active day-to-day, this is how the show should be running on a day-to-day business. That's not what they do. However, big corporations, Clear Channel is now a major force on Broadway, as are a number of other big entities. It has pushed out the smaller independent producer to some effect. Clear Channel in particular has many, many theaters across the country, and pretty much everybody wants Clear Channel to be on board because that almost ensures that you're going to get a great national tour out of your show, playing all their markets, which are everywhere. I mean, it's very widespread across America, but it is less and less the independent standalone producer is not a thing of the past, but it's certainly a lot less than it used to be, say, 30 years ago.
That's why I'm beginning to look like a dinosaur. That's what
And I
happens.
also think today there are some, like Wicked has Universal up top.
Absolutely.
And Universal Pictures, Universal Studios, or Disney's involved in a lot of the theater productions now. And I think a lot of that also is for future rights. We are starting to get back to more of the movie musical. Chicago changed that. Now everybody's looking, can this be a movie? And if Universal's on in the beginning, they've got the rights locked up for Wicked. If they make a movie of Wicked, Universal's in there. And that's another reason some of them come on. And with Universal, there was a guy named Mark Platt, who's a lead producer on Universal. He works for, who's a lead producer on Wicked. He works for Universal. So that tie-in's a natural thing. And he got Universal to come on board as part of the producing
That's
element.
absolutely correct. In fact, Universal had the rights to the story, and they wouldn't let the Broadway show move forward without their active participation. And of course, they're a great business partner. They have lots of resources, so it was a natural that they take a leading role as a producer of Wicked.
And I think, oh, I'm sorry, Mike.
No,
and
go
I
ahead.
think the other element is they're making a musical, Elton John's making a musical of The Vampire Lestat, which is a Warner Brothers project. And again, they're going to be on board as part of that producing element
Right.
for The Vampire Lestat.
That's right.
So a lot of times people get behind it that way. Sometimes there's just names that put their name to it, products. When we did the last tour of Peter Pan, we had Cran Raisin. It was a new product. Everything we had Cran Raisin on it. Ocean Spray. And they
Cross-promotion.
Right.
That's right.
But also, one thing, Ben, it was a very good question that you have to take into consideration. For example, you talk about Universal, and you talk about Clear Channel. Right now, a big musical is ready to open in about a month, Mary Poppins in London. Mary Poppins is a combination of the Disney company and probably, arguably, the best musical theater producer in the theater today, Cameron Mackintosh. Now, Cameron Mackintosh has never worked with anybody before. He started with Andrew Lloyd Webber, but he was the lead producer. Why did he get involved with Disney? Simple. Disney had all the songs, the film rights, and Cameron Mackintosh owned the rights from the book. And the writer of the book upon which Mary Poppins is based wanted Cameron McIntosh to do the legit version. So there was a wedding. There was a blending. But all those names up there don't mean that those people, let's forget about brands for a moment. Let's talk about individual names. It doesn't mean that those people have a say, will tell you what to do, although they will try. It means they put up a lot of money, and what they have to do is they want a credit. If somebody's willing to put up a lot of money, hey,
Absolutely.
take a credit. Okay?
That's correct.
Kelly?
I have a question for you, Mr. Gill.
Yes.
Could you explain the difference between the creative team and management, and how much do their roles overlap, or should they not?
Well, the creative team is really the people who are putting together the show on an artistic level. The writers, the director, the choreographer, the designers. That's who I consider to be the creative team. They're the ones that should take the artistic vision and flesh it out and take it from page to stage. Now, I said to Mike the other day that I step in and I'm often the harsh reality of, okay, it's great that you want it to reign over the audience, but that's not going to happen for many reasons. And sometimes you have to reel back in the creative staff to make their vision a little more realistic, a little more doable. And that goes whether you're in the not-for-profit arena or in the for-profit arena. There is a financial reality of any artistic vision. And you have to make sure that either the not-for-profit organization or an independent producer can actually fund the vision properly.
Right, right. Daniel, do you have a question?
Well, you talked about budgets earlier, and I was curious, in Glen's class we've talked about various aspects of the budget, and when there are cost overruns,
Yes.
obviously the producer doesn't want to put up more money, and it comes down to you of how do you distribute money to sets that have suddenly built this lavish set but they can't finish it. How do you go about
I'm going to give away a trade secret, and hopefully none of my designers will be watching this episode. I budget a good 15 to 20% higher in each category than what I tell the designer they have to spend.
Bravo, bravo.
So,
Very good, thank you. Bianca, do you have a question?
Yeah, going with the budget, how do you check when you have you mentioned earlier briefly the box office statements.
yes.
How do you check that for accuracy? So you do it after every show or weekly?
It is after every show. As you can imagine, most of the people on this side are sort of number crazy. I happen to work with a lot of producers that are overseas. Andrew Lloyd Webber's company, the Really Useful Group, the producers of Mamma Mia are British, the producers of We Will Rock You are British. I just happen to have a lot of British-based clients at the moment. And believe me, when they wake up in the morning, they want an email from my firm saying exactly what happened the night before, and it has to be really accurate. I mean, financial accuracy is the foundation of what a good management firm does. And it would be a whole discussion as to how we make sure it's accurate, but there's lots of double checks in theater nowadays. It's much easier now that it's computerized. I started in the late 70s when things were still on hard ticket before box office computers were around. It was a little easier to sort of make the cash go this way or that way back then. I'm happy that we're in the computer age, and it's a little more difficult to fudge the numbers.
But nevertheless, it's an excellent question, Bianca. I must commend
Yes.
you for it, because it's something that we're all concerned with, all of us on this side. Whether you be a creative producer or a business producer, I think personally, and maybe I'm a little bit of both, but you depend on people like Michael Gill and then Michael Gill's colleagues, company managers, to get that statement, get
Absolutely.
it after everything, and find out what is deadwood, which is another phrase. How many seats did you give away? What are comps, etc.? Because there are ways that people have tried in the past to, shall we
Absolutely.
say, fudge it.
Right.
You know?
It's also a marketing tool. It's also what's selling. The discounts are selling, the full prices are not. Okay, that's a marketing trend you should follow.
Well, with having said that, Michael, I want to thank you again.
Very welcome.
For really
Happy to be here.
enlightening. Well, we're all very happy to have you, and I know that students out there who are viewing this are happy to have the benefit of your experience and your background. And I want to thank all the students who've been here today. But
Right.
this is just a little bit, this is the, if I can use a trite phrase, the tip of the iceberg. You can get into something of this nature, as you said. You can spend hours on every individual subject, right?
That's
Whether it be-
correct. Absolutely. I've done whole 3-hour seminars just on royalty pools or on box office statements. So.
Right. Well, thank you again for coming, and thank you for being with us and enlightening all of us, and thank the students. And we'll see you in a bit.